All right, so we're in the garage today and we're going to be changing the head gasket on my 1989 Civic Si. So it's a huge fiasco with this Civic. It blew the head gasket a couple of years ago, and when it did so, I took it upon myself to change the head gasket then, but I screwed it up and I threw the timing belt tensioner through the timing belt, bent all the valves. So I actually ended up putting a remanufactured head on, but I think from overheating the block and the new head being put on, I think the block was warped and the new head didn't sit flush with the block. So we're going to take it apart today and figure out why is it blowing so much oil. We're going to be putting a new head gasket in and see if we can do something to get it to stop burning so much oil, because as much fun as it is, I have to get this thing to pass emissions, get it registered, and really it should be fixed because it's an environmental disaster. So let's take a look and see what we got. It's a chilly day in the garage today. I've got the heater going. Oh, look. So this thing bottoms out at 32 degrees, but we got it up to 33 in here. So it's a regular heat wave in here. But I've also got it running on the compressor. We're going to need some compressed air later. So I've got it going a little for the compressor and a little for me. So get it to warm up a little bit. And I've got the car jacked up. It isn't, well, I guess it is necessary because we're going to be draining the oil and the coolant underneath. But I've got it jacked up so we can drain the fluids, and then it also just makes it a little bit easier to be working on the engine up top. Okay, my cable doesn't work that well. But anyways. Oh yeah, what a beaut. So if you watched my fluorescent oil video, you know already that I've got some leaks underneath of here. So I've got oil dripping down the block and leaking from somewhere up top. I don't think it's the valve cover gasket, because if we look at the head, it's actually really clean all along here. And putting the black light on the block after we put in some of that fluorescent oil, it was kind of lighting up through here. So that's why I think it's leaking from the head gasket here, is we're getting oil leakage, but it's not from the valve cover gasket. First things first, we're just going to be disconnecting the battery here and getting it out of the engine bay. So we're just going to start with that because we're going to be taking off the intake not the intake manifold, the intake. So, oh, don't do that. Don't do what I was just doing. That was a big no-no. Luckily, these are coated, but be very careful to not make the two contacts short together. So watch out for that. So now we just need to get this bracket disconnected. Looks like it's a 10 as well. Nope. What are you, an 11? So I just loosened this bolt up top, and we can see that it kind of folds into the slot in the bottom, so we just need to pull that out. And then the other side, probably be easier to get to that once we get the battery out of here, so let's pull the battery out. Okay, so I just set it off to the side here, and I've got a cap on the positive lead just so I don't end up shorting them while I'm walking around the garage and maybe back into it or something. So we'll just pull out this little plastic tray underneath the battery. Maybe yours has that, maybe it doesn't. And then just get it out of the slot and take out this bracket. So before we start working on top again and taking out all this stuff, we're going to start draining the coolant, get that going, and then we're going to come back up top and start working on this. All right. So we're going to get it underneath of the car here. So the drain cock for the radiator is right there. So we're just coming right underneath the car. Just get that. You can use a pair of needle nose on the end of that drain cock there to loosen it if you need to. Well, it's fairly loose now, so it's not too bad. So I'm gonna hold up the drain pan to catch any fluid, because it comes out in a small stream. So anything that lands in the pan, it's gonna splash all over the place. So I'm just gonna bring up the pan a little bit, hold it in place, and allow it to start draining. One thing I forgot to do is loosen the drain cap up top. So it's going to create a vacuum and come out of here really slowly. So I'm gonna very carefully try to hold this pan in place while I go up top. And you know what, that's a bad idea. Let's get a box to support this pan, and then I'm gonna go up top. So that's all I needed. It was creating a vacuum in the radiator with that cap. So that's all I needed, is creating a vacuum in the radiator with the cap on. So just let that go and it'll start to bleed. Now we're going to take off the intake. And one of my previous owners installed this strut tower bar. So we're going to have to take that off to get the cylinder head out of here. So we're going to be taking that off as well. All right, to get the intake off, I've got this little bolt here holding on the housing. It looks like this one's just a hex nut. It doesn't have the flathead slot. Okay, apparently the filter just wants to volunteer as tribute, so we'll just take that off first. Okay, so sometimes the rubber kind of bonds to the metal a little bit from the temperature changes and the heat, so I'll hold the rubber part and then try to create some torque, and then that'll break it loose. All right, so I need to get the strut tower bar out of here. Yours might not have it, so it's just the 2 bolts on that side and the 2 bolts on this side. Pretty easy to take out. All right, so I got the strut tower bar here, and it always, oh no. And this is the point of why I make these videos, is so I can screw up, so that way you don't make the same mistakes. So because the wheels were off the ground and I let go of the shock towers, they just kind of fell through. I thought that the control arms would support them, but I wasn't so lucky. And now our coolant is finished draining here, so we can see the stream has stopped. So I'm gonna go up top and I'm gonna put the coolant, or the reservoir cap, back on. So I'm going to empty out this catch pan here into a container to take it to the auto parts store. So there's another coolant drain plug back here. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the exhaust manifold, get that out of the way completely, so we can get to that one after draining our used coolant. So this is an aftermarket header here. So it's going to be a little bit different depending on what you have. But basically, it's these bolts all along here. And then underneath, in the downpipe, the header downpipe, there's a couple of bolts on either side. So that's the same for stock or for aftermarket. There should be a couple bolts here, depending on what you have aftermarket, if you do have an aftermarket exhaust. So just need to get those out of here, and then get this manifold out, and that'll make it a lot easier to work around the cylinder head, getting it out of the way. So there'll be a heat shroud in here that has 3 bolts in it. So you just have to take those bolts off to reveal the header, and then you can get to the header that way. So the last time I did this job, I tried to keep the manifold in place. I didn't disconnect it from its downpipe. And so even though I disconnected these bolts, it was really difficult to work the manifold out of the way. So I highly suggest just getting the manifold completely out of here, so that way you're not trying to wrestle with it as you're taking out the cylinder head, because the alignment is really important when you're getting the cylinder head put back on. So I need to take out the dipstick for this bolt down here. So I'm just going to take that out real quick and then put it back in so I don't drop anything down in the engine. Alright, so I've got all these bolts out now. So before I get too carried away trying to get the manifold out, I do need to come underneath here and disconnect the oxygen sensor. I don't have to remove it from the manifold, but I just need to disconnect the lead so it's not tugging at that wire as I try to lift it out. One way to get the wire off, but it wasn't the way I was hoping for. Okay, with the harness out, as best as I'm going to get it, there's 3 bolts down here. There's one there. There we go. There you can see it. One there. And then one back around to the side. So I just need to crawl underneath and get to those bolts and loosen those up, and we should be able to get the manifold out of here. Okay, so this one's being an extreme pain to get out of here. So you can see I've got this contraption going on, trying to get enough leverage on it because I can't get the breaker bar or my impact wrench underneath. So I'm going to hit this with a little bit of penetrating oil, let it sit for a couple minutes, and see if I can use this to get enough torque to get this bolt out of here. Okay, so what I ended up doing is I pried the exhaust manifold off of the studs. I kind of tucked it underneath, and that allowed me to get this kind of tucked away from the subframe. And so that was just enough I could get a good angle on that bolt and finally hit it with the impact wrench. Alright, so now that I got the manifold out of here finally, you can see the drain bolt for the coolant here. So we're going to take that out, and that's going to drain all the coolant that's within the block in the cylinder head. So it'll get all that coolant out of there, give us a nice clean workspace. And I'm a little worried about my exhaust here, that I'm going to be getting coolant that pours into the pipes. So I'm going to see if I can get something that'll kind of block that off a little bit. So I'm actually using the battery tray here. It's just kind of a block off to keep some of the coolant from getting into the exhaust. And then underneath I've got my drip pan. So let's go get that socket and get that out of there. 19 it is. So my problem is there's so much oil buildup on this thing, it looked like it was bigger than it is. So I just had to wiggle that on there. There we go. No, there it goes. There it goes. Alright, I've got my drain pan all nice and clean. We're going to go underneath here and drain the oil now. So the oil isn't warm because you can't take off the cylinder head when the coolant is at temperature. So it has to be below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's nothing to worry about here today. So before I go and remove the drain plug, I'm just going to get some of this coolant out of here. You can see there's a little drop it right there, a little bit on the downpipe still. So I'm just going to get some of this coolant wiped up out of here to keep it from dripping down into my oil while I'm draining the oil. Alright, so I got it all cleaned up underneath. So now I'm going to go for the drain plug here. It's interesting with that fluorescent dye, now that it has all of the exhaust gases and distillates mixed into it, how it has that color. So it's kind of like a greenish but murky color. Okay, so now we're ready to just start digging into this and just disconnect everything that's connected to the cylinder head and the intake manifold. And I want to try to see if I can take the intake manifold off with the cylinder head, because last time I did this I took the intake manifold off, and getting to the bolts for the intake manifold are near impossible with how they're positioned. So I want to take it off with the intake manifold still attached, and then bring it all out, do what I need to do, and then bring it back with the intake manifold. So first of all, I'm just going to get the spark plug wires out of here. They're mostly clean, that's a good sign. It means the valve cover gaskets are holding. I never bother marking where the spark plug wires go. I just look it up and hook it up accordingly when I put it all back together. So I've got those off to the side. I'm going to remove the distributor now, which means unplugging these wires now. I think I'm going to undo the distributor first. I'm going to undo that guy and then get it off and undo the wires then. I think that'll make it a little bit easier maybe. 12? Are you a 12? Yeah, although my socketing box ends don't fit in here. It's hard to get a socket on these guys. So that's where the box end really comes into play. Well, I'm not using the box end, I'm using the open side. So one thing you can do is mark the top of the distributor here, but just put a line between the bracket and the distributor to mark where your timing was. I'll just put a mark in here just to show where it was, but then we're probably going to end up retiming this anyways. So a socket with an extension works pretty well on this back one. All right, and then just gently pull it off of here. Okay, so we've got these connectors here for the temperature control, and then we also have this hose that we're going to have to disconnect. So with these coolant hoses, once you finally get the connectors loose, you want to twist it a little bit to break the tension to the housing that it's on. Because if you just pull on it, you're at risk of damaging the hose. So I'm going to use the channel locks here. Just give it a little bit of encouragement to break that bond. Well, all right then. Well, we got the job done though, so that's all that matters. So we have this fuel line here as well as this radiator hose that we need to disconnect. There's another connection down here that we need to deal with. All right, so now the upper radiator hose needs to go. It's a lot easier with these style clamps when you can actually get to the bolt on it. Nut, bolt, whatever. Okay, so just twist there. This is a hack job because for some reason they put a different connector on here. I don't know why. Whew. All right. All right, so now we're going to go for the throttle cable. So you just push along here to relieve the tension in the cable, and then bring it around past the retaining feature, and then just kind of wiggle it out a little bit. Now our throttle cable is disconnected, so now we just need to take off a little bit of tension here, and then we'll get the throttle cable out of the way. Okay, so 12 millimeter here. There's the ticket. So we just need to loosen this enough, and then it should just pull out of this. It's just going to back it off all the way here. Oh, actually, don't need to go all the way. When you go part of the way, you can see there's a little notch. So we're just gonna come here to the notch, and then it'll pull out. So now we got the cables clear. So now we just need to disconnect the brake booster. This is the brake booster over here. So we need to disconnect this hose that runs through here to this little thing. So just disconnect this hose right here. Okay, brake booster disconnected. Then we need to disconnect this fuel vacuum hose here. I'm going to disconnect this grounding cable here. Alright, so we need to disconnect this vapor hose thingamajig from the charcoal canister. And then we also need to disconnect the fuel line here. So take this guy just like that. Oh, it's coming. Come on. There we go. All right. Then we got this banjo bolt thingamajig to deal with. Now, what you're going to want to do is relieve the pressure in the fuel system. And what you can do is just pop the gas cap here, and that'll relieve pressure in the fuel tank, which will relieve some of the pressure in the system and prevent it from spraying on you when you take out those bolts. What you can do to make things a little bit easier is just take the charcoal canister here and get it out of the way. So all you need to do is just kind of lift up on it, and then it'll just pull out. Next, what you're going to do is take a 17 millimeter bolt and just remove that one there. And now the challenge with this is we need to prevent the fuel filter itself from trying to rotate as we're breaking this free. Sometimes you can get lucky and grab onto the metal part of the hose and use that as bracing to keep it from rotating. I got my 17mm wrench, and now that we removed that other bolt, I can get my wrench in here nice and tight. We can just remove it like so. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the electrical connections here for the fuel injectors. And once we have these disconnected, and then the other connector on the other side, that's going to allow us to get this wiring harness kind of tucked back here out of the way. And then we're going to disconnect the small vacuum lines running from the intake manifold. We're going to disconnect those. Just disconnecting this vacuum line here real quick. And then this one here kind of runs back around to this tube. So I'm just going to take this off of the back of the manifold. Actually, it came without any resistance at all. So now I'm going to undo the bolt for the fuel injectors. So this bolt right here, I'm missing one here, so there's two bolts here and here. I'm going to undo this bolt and then undo the clips on the injectors. Okay, so there's just these little metal clips on the injectors that we have to pry off. And screwdriver's your friend on this one. Just have to be careful not to let it slip. I got all four connectors off. Now I just lift it up off of the posts, and it is now free. So if you chase this connector off of the fuel rail down to here, you see there's another connector here on the throttle body. Come off of here. Oh, okay, so we don't have to handle the Phillips head there. I'm going to get the harness pushed up behind the throttle body, so that way I can bring the throttle body up and clear the harness. So I just need to come over to this side, do a little bit more work on this side to get it to clear the throttle body. So there's the throttle position sensor wire here that we have to disconnect. And then I also just came down in here, bringing you around to show you what I did. So my reverse position sensor on the transmission, I disconnected these wires here just so I could get a little bit more slack on this cable here. Alright, next up on our agenda, we're going to be taking the valve cover off. So before we get too carried away, I just put the nut back on the post for the fuel connectors, so that way it doesn't get lost somewhere in here. So word of caution with the valve cover is when you go to take this thing off, these are deceptively pressed into there, so it's a little rubber bushing, and when you take it off, they're not going to want to come out. But the second you take this thing off and you tilt it, they're all going to fall off and fly all over the garage. It's pretty much guaranteed this isn't going to come off without a fight. Although mine's been off somewhat recently, so it's not putting up too much resistance. Depending on how long yours has been on there, it might put up a bit of a fight. If yours is putting up a fight, don't put a screwdriver or something in here to pry it off, because you'll nick that surface and then you'll just cause a point for oil leaks. What you want to do is just take a rubber mallet and kind of tap on it around the valve cover, and that'll just kind of help to break some of that tension that's in there. Probably should have removed that ground wire, but whatever. But mine's coming off without much resistance. Like I said, it's been off recently. So it's taking the black light through here and just seeing what I see. What I did notice is I've got a bit of an oil leak on this spark plug tube This one bone dry. So we've got the valve cover off now. What we're going to do, we're going to come around, turn off the black light for starters. We're going to take off the valve, or the timing belt cover, if you have it equipped. A lot of people, once they do the timing belt service, they just leave this thing off. So it's just a couple of bolts in here that we just have to get to get that timing belt cover off. So just knock those out and get this off of here. All right, so these are 10 millimeters in here. Okay. And out comes the cover, maybe. And just be careful to not touch the timing belt or get anything on it. Well, it depends. So with this type of head gasket job, it's one of those things. Go ahead and do the timing belt and the water pump while you're at it. But I did this job about 10,000 miles ago, and ever since it's been burning oil. So I'm going to inspect the timing belt and see what kind of condition it is and if it's got any oil on it or anything. From what I can tell up here, it looks like it's still in really good shape, and I don't see any obvious oil, so I think it's in good condition to be reused. In which case, just be really careful if you are going to reuse your timing belt to not touch it. Don't touch it with oily gloves or anything, and just steer clear of it. So now what we need to do is we need to get our cylinder head and the pistons timed together while we still have the timing belt connected to top dead center on cylinder 1. And the idea here is we want to get everything nice and timed at top dead center on this cylinder before we remove the cylinder head, because once we take off the cylinder head, they lose communication with each other. And if something happens while we're on the bench and working with the cylinder head, if we accidentally move the cam gears, we can put the cylinder head out of timing. So putting everything to top dead center on cylinder 1 gives us a reference point that we can go back to. And there should be marks on your cam gears on what is what exactly. I'm going to pull the spark plug on cylinder 1, and then we can put a pin or something long enough into that cylinder, and we can watch for top dead center on this cylinder. So let's pull that spark plug down. That's some good stuff. I have this little telescoping magnetic pen thingy that I'm going to be using. And really we just need anything with sufficient length to fit down through the well and touch the piston. So it doesn't matter too much what you use as long as it's narrow and of course clean so we don't get any contamination into the cylinder. We're just going to put that into our cylinder like so. So you come in through the driver's side wheel well, and right there you can see the bolt for the crankshaft. So we're going to be putting a 19 millimeter bolt on there, and we're going to be rotating the engine counterclockwise until it reaches its highest point. So you can see that we're coming up to the top, and that was top dead center there. Now it's going back down. So we're gonna go for another revolution. And there we see it's coming back up again. Okay, so I want to go find, this is top dead center, but I want to go find the next point because I believe that's going to line up with our cam marks. Alright, so there we have it. We have found top dead center as verified by our pin, and we also have top dead center as indicated by the cam gear. So we have the white mark, the up symbol, both facing up. That's where we want to be. So we are set to continue. We're going to now disconnect we're going to remove the timing belt, and then that's going to free us to remove the cylinder head. There you see it. There is our timing belt tensioner bolt. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen that guy. Loosen only. We are not going to remove that. This is a very important distinction. I made the mistake. I removed that the last time I did this job, and when I went to go put it back, I unknowingly cross-threaded it, and that's how I bent my valves before. So we're just going to loosen this. That will relieve tension on the timing belt and allow us to slip the timing belt off of the cam gears, but we do not need to remove that bolt all the way. So this one's a real challenge to line up. We just want to loosen this a couple threads, but no more. So our timing belt should have tension relieved now. I'm going to get a couple of fresh paper towels, work the belt a little bit. I'm using the paper towels to keep my grimy mitts off of the belt. The belt is off. We are now clear to remove the cylinder head. Long last, we're there. Now, we've got the 10 cylinder bolts, 5 on this side, and then 5 on the back that we're going to undo. And these bolts probably aren't going to come without a fight, because they're spec'd to 50 foot-pounds, and they're in a very hot environment, so they're expanding and contracting all the time. So odds are they're probably not going to come out, so we're just going to get the breaker bar for these and give them some encouragement. So here goes nothing. So first one, not too bad. Of course, this job, like I said, it's only been about 2 years, not many miles. So these bolts haven't been taxed too much, but if you're working on an older cylinder head, they'll probably put up quite a fight. Be oily when you take them out, so I just got a paper towel to catch them as I remove them. So I'm just going to put my magnet on here. Should provide enough magnetic force to lift this bolt out once it's free. So at this point we should be clear to remove the cylinder head. We've got everything disconnected. And over here I created a little safe landing zone for the cylinder head. So it's going to be crucial when handling the cylinder head that we don't damage or mar the surface that the head gasket seats to, because if we damage that surface it can create a leak, which can allow exhaust gases out or coolant or oil in, which will lead to a damaged engine. So we want to be very careful to take good care of this cylinder head, and we also just want to watch this surface as well for the valve cover gasket. So let's see if we can get this thing lifted out of here. It's advisable, if you do have a friend available, to get 2 people to lift this out. It is a little on the heavy side, but let's see how this goes. Alright, so here we've got the cylinder head removed, and I've just got it resting down here on the floor on the padded surface here just to help protect the gasket surface. So hopefully yours went a little bit smoother than mine did. I forgot a couple of wires and hoses back here, and I made sure to put notes beforehand just showing off because I didn't have the footage of disconnecting those. So I just had a couple of wires and hoses I forgot to disconnect, so I was kind of hung up trying to bring off the cylinder head. Okay, so now that we have the head off, and we're kind of clear of everything, it's kind of just a good idea to take a little bit of time, clean up the pistons a little bit, and see what else is going on in the engine bay and just take care of any issues you're having. So for example, I'm having an issue in the back with the radiator fan switch. So that sensor, or maybe the wire, failed somewhere along the lines. So I'm just going to get back here now that I have the intake manifold off. It's going to be really easy to get to that sensor. So I'm just going to knock that out while I'm in here, and just kind of feel free to just do whatever you need to do while you have the engine bay all cleaned up like this. Okay, so I have this plastic scraper that I picked up a while ago that I'm going to be using. So we want to use a plastic scraper and not like a razor blade or take any wire brushes or anything to the gasket surface, because if we do, we're going to mar the surface, and then that won't have a nice clean surface for the gasket to seat onto. So we just want to use very non-aggressive surfaces, or non-aggressive tools like this one here, just to clean up the surface. So I had a metal gasket on here last time, so I don't have much to clean up. It's not like a composite gasket, which would leave behind kind of that composite material. So it's going to be relatively easy, at least, for me to clean up the surface. Just spend some time and get this thing looking real nice and clean. And same thing with the pistons. You don't have to worry about the pistons. You can go a little aggressive on the pistons to clean those up. So you don't have to worry about marring that surface as much. But do watch the cylinder walls. We want to be very careful not to do anything to those cylinder walls while we have the top open like this. So I've got the block cleaned up a little bit, and you can see the pistons there are clean. But those two are recessed within their cylinders, so I can't clean those pistons. But now that we have the cylinder head off, what we can do is we can use our wrench, like so, and we can use the wrench to crank the block, or crank the crankshaft, ironic, and we can do that to change the position of the cylinders. So long as the cylinder head is off, the cylinder head is going to keep its setting for top dead center on cylinder 1. So we can bring these two pistons up so we can clean those ones and take a look at what's going on. And then once we're done with that, as long as we just go back to top dead center on that cylinder there, or that one, same difference really, then we're going to be good to go. So one thing about this job that's worth considering is that when you take the cylinder head off, you've gone most of the way towards taking apart the engine. And so if you have a higher mileage engine, it might be worth considering to replace your rings. And I'm seeing here on this cylinder wall, there's kind of some oil and stuff going on up there where it should be sealing with the rings. So that might be where I'm getting some of my oil burning from. Is you can see that the rings aren't really sealing that well. So something to consider, you know, it's just one of those jobs, while you're at it, you might as well rebuild the engine. So now that I've got the engine kind of cleaned up, I recessed all of the pistons, so they're kind of in the cylinders now. But what I did to help diagnose what's going on is I got this aluminum straight edge off of Amazon. So the straight edge says it's accurate to 0.02 of an inch. So with all of the overheating that this block has gone through with all of its head gasket issues and whatever, what I want to do is I want to use the straight edge to see, has the block warped at all. So I got it out of the box. You can see this very nice shiny machined surface. That's going to be our controlling surface. This other side isn't held to the same standard because it doesn't have that machined face on it. Okay, so I got the 38-inch straight edge. That's too big. So word of advice, if you're going to go the same route, just get the 24-inch. I think that'll fit in here a lot better. First, I'm going to use my flashlight and just see if I can see any light coming through underneath. And then after that, I'm just going to use the feeler gauges and go through and see what the gaps are along the block and see what's going on. I've got my smallest gauge here. This is the 004 to 006. And I'm just going to be going along and seeing if this will slide underneath the straight edge anywhere, because that will show us if we have a gap somewhere. Is we need to go through and clean up all of the holes that the bolts pass through. So we need to clean up these holes because oil and dirt and stuff collects on it, and once we take off that cylinder hole or that cylinder head, they kind of, all that stuff pools into the bolt holes. As we're going to get the compressor fired up and get that charging air in it. So hopefully it's been sitting with the heater on it long enough that the oil is nice and toasty and it'll just start up for us. So this compressor doesn't like starting in the cold, and hopefully it's warm enough that it's going to actually start for us. Okay, so the compressor is nice and charged up, so I'm going to be using this to spray out the stuff that's in the bolt holes in the block. So the thing is, if you don't have a compressor, what you can do is that instead of using the compressor, you can get those little canisters of like keyboard cleaner or electronics cleaner at the store, and you can use those actually to basically utilize the compressed air that's in those canisters to blow out the holes. So that's actually what I ended up doing the last time I did this, but this time around I'm fortunate enough to have a compressor, so I'm going to be using that. Alright, so here's the thing with using compressed air to blow fluid out of these holes, is that there's going to be a ton of fluids flying out of these bolt holes as you're spraying it out. So this is definitely one of those things we want to utilize safety first and put on our safety glasses. So to give you an idea of what we're looking at here, you can see this hole is completely full of coolant and oil. This one over here has a little bit less stuff, so not as bad. But we just want to go through each of these and just clean them up a little bit. What I've also done is I set aside the old head bolts over here. So I set those aside, and what I'm going to use those to do is once I get the holes cleaned out, I'm just going to use those to chase the threads and make sure that there's nothing kind of left behind that's going to gum up the new bolts. I'm going to be using my compressed air, which is a little bit leaky, and I'm going to be using this paper towel. So I'm going to spray into the hole, and then I'm going to use the paper towel to catch any fluids that are coming out. So watch that. I accidentally pulled the nozzle out a little bit and got some air into this coolant channel, and it sprayed a bunch of coolant everywhere, so just watch out for that. And I'm chasing the threads using one of the old bolts. So I'm just chasing it down in there, kind of hand tightening a little bit. See if I can clear out some of that gunk that's in there. And you want to watch it too. If it doesn't go in hand tight, then something's wrong and it's worth looking into a little bit. So for example, that one cleaned out pretty nicely. Let's get a rag. So that one I can hand tighten quite a ways, whereas for example this one here, I get it in there and then it kind of puts up resistance after a few threads. So we'll have to look into these a little bit, because it'd be terrible if we actually put the head on and then we go to put the bolts in and then we discover that the threads have crap in them or the threads are chewed up over time, who knows. So we just want to make sure that we have a nice clean thread before we go to install the cylinder head. But it was important to clear out the fluid that was in the bolt holes, because if there's fluid in there and you try to bring in the bolt and tighten it, that fluid can basically hydrolock and keep the bolt from tightening because the fluid's incompressible, so you're trying to push the bolt into fluid and it doesn't want to go anywhere. And one thing I did is I just kind of went around and I cleaned up and got inside of the cylinders and cleaned up the pistons. Some stuff splashed on the pistons, so I just went and cleaned those up. So now that the block is looking pretty good, let's take to the cylinder head and get this cleaned up and ready to be installed again. So first of all, I'm get some of the stuff out of the way. First of all, we're just going to take off the old head gasket, and we can see it's been kind of mangled in the uninstallation process. So we'll just mangle it a little bit more and just get it out of here. And we can see what's left behind is a bunch of oil and stuff. So we just need to go through, clean all of this up, and then we're going to be removing these dowels. So the reason why we want to remove the dowels is the dowels actually install into the block, and then we put the head gasket over the dowels in the block, and then we bring our cylinder head over on top. If we keep the dowels in the cylinder head and put the head gasket over on the block, we're going to mangle the head gasket trying to install the cylinder head with these dowels sticking out. So we're just going to take these out, clean it up, and then while we're at it, you might as well just clean up the valves a little bit. Just give them a little clean, remove some of the carbon, and then we should be good to go. For these dowels, you want to be very, very careful to not mar the surface that the head gasket seats on. So we just need to be careful not to damage that at all. So one tip I saw is to put a socket into the dowel, and then we're going to get some vice grips, just clamp down on that combination there. Again, being careful not to damage the surface underneath. Okay, watch out for that. But look, the dowel is out. So I've tried fighting those off in the past with needle nose pliers, didn't really work. So vice grips are the way to go on that. This would be a good place for our scraper again. Just work on that for a while, get it nice and clean, and then we should be ready to put it back on. Oh, one thing I just noticed, I've got my exhaust manifold gasket still on here. So I'm going to pull this off. We're going to be putting a new gasket on because that's what came in my kit. So we'll just ditch that, get a new gasket in here, and then hopefully don't leak exhaust gases. Brought out these plastic putty knives that I've had for a while, and these are just doing a great job compared to that little plastic scraper I had. So I'd recommend going and picking up a set of these plastic scrapers, possibly, or if you have some on hand, just use those. So just got the putty knife here, and it's doing pretty good. So one thing, some throttle body cleaner too might help. So I've been using some of that, seems to help out. Got the cylinder head all nice and cleaned up, about as good as I'm going to get it, I think. I didn't want to get too aggressive with the surface because I didn't want to mess it up and end up creating leaks through messing with the surface too much. So I've got it about that clean. And then over in the engine compartment, I've got the block all nice and cleaned up. I returned my cylinder number one, or piston number one, back to top dead center now that I've gone through and kind of cleaned up all the pistons. And then I also just took the opportunity with the cylinder head off to just address some things going on back here. Okay, so my kit that I bought didn't come with new dowels, so I'm going to be reusing the dowels that I pulled out of the cylinder head. So we want to pull them out of the cylinder head so we can install them into the block. So if you notice, these 4 holes here have a slightly larger diameter than the rest of the bolt holes. So we're going to put these dowels into those holes that are larger than the rest. So now that we have those dowels in, we can put our head gasket on, and the head gasket's going to go over those dowels, so those are going to help locate the head gasket on here. Okay, so I just realized something here. So my head gasket, the holes for the pins are down here. So I need to go back and take that one dowel and move it to the bottom. So when you look at it, it looks like it can go either way. But as it turns out, if you try to locate it this way, the holes along the top don't line up. So we're going to, at least with this Felpro, I've got these blue lines here. Those are going to face the block. And then I've got this kind of matte surface here. I think this is kind of like a built-in gasket sealant thingy. So that's going to face upward toward the cylinder head. Okay, so I'm just going around trying to shape this back into a circle. You can see that one side there is deciding it doesn't want to be a circle anymore. So I'm trying to clean this up. So just a little bit of patience. Okay, so I now have the head gasket installed on the block with the head gasket over the dowels. So they're a really tight fit, and they're going to require a little bit of work to get the head gasket to fit over the dowels. But now that it's lined up, this means that we're now ready to bring the cylinder head in here and mate it back to the block. With this operation, you have to be very, very careful. And it's probably a good idea to have a friend on hand to help locate the cylinder head, because we need to get the cylinder head to locate on these two dowels and then bring it gently downward. So the thing is, if we mess up and we bring the cylinder head in here at an angle, we risk damaging the head gasket in the process. And if we damage the head gasket, then that means that we're going to have leaks and other kinds of things going wrong with the head gasket. So it's a very delicate operation. So with that, I wish you good luck, and hopefully you can get things aligned properly without damaging the gasket. One tip I forgot to mention, I had the valve cover just kind of sitting on here when I was bringing over the cylinder head, just to protect the valve train so I didn't grab onto it or something. Got it successfully put on there. It wasn't quite as clean as I was hoping for, but it is on there, so hopefully that's all there is to it, and I got it sealed. Okay, so I got my new bolts here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find the bolts with the spirals on them, so I'm going to be using these bolts, which fortunately aren't the bolts specified with the TSB, but as long as I keep the engine from overheating, hopefully it will be enough to keep everything kind of nice and buttoned up. So ideally you'll find the bolts with the spirals down the shaft like that, and that's the bolt that we should be using. What we're going to do is we're going to take the bolts and just put them in hand tight for now, and then we're going to go back and follow the torque sequence to tighten down the bolts. So before you put in the bolt, what we want to do is dip the end of the bolt into fresh oil, and the idea is that lubricates the threads, so when we go to torque the bolt, we know that the torque that we're setting for the bolt is the true torque, and it's not because the threads are cut up on something or binding somewhere. So we're just going to get a little bit of fresh oil on the threads before we put in the bolt. We're just going to go put in the 10 bolts hand tight, and we're going to come back through and follow the torque sequence. So 5-quart jugs aren't the easiest way to do this. Alright, there we go. Just a little bit of oil. It's a little difficult to get in here with my hands, so I'm just going to use a socket with an extension on it, and that will allow me to get it hand tight without trying to reach around the valve springs there. Okay. So I've got the handy dandy torque wrench, and so now we're going to bolt down the cylinder head. So there's a very specific sequence that we have to follow, as well as a very specific torque sequence that we have to follow. So first off, we are going to set the wrench to 14 foot-pounds. And then we start here. This is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we go through and we tighten those in sequence at 14 inch-pounds, and then we go back, set our wrench to 36, follow the same sequence, and then lastly we go to 49 inch-pounds. This will be our final sequence, and we tighten in the same order. So this is the updated torque sequence, and this is in the technical service bulletin. So this is the one that we want to be following, because the old sequence, that's where they figured out that, you know, they were getting head gasket leaks. So we just want to follow the technical service bulletin. That completes our first sequence at 14. Now we're going to kick it up a notch to 36. That was 36. And now we're going to 49 to finish it off. At this point, I want to put the timing belt back on, and then with the timing belt back on, I'm going to put the valve cover on, and then that way I can just kind of go through the engine and put everything back on and not have to worry about dropping anything into the cylinder head. So I just want to double check the cam gear here and check the timing mark and just make sure that I'm still where it's supposed to be before I put the timing belt on. It looks like it's good, and I did have the block set to top dead center. So at this point I'm in the clear to put the timing belt back onto the gear. Yep. Trap my glove. Trap my glove. There we go. So if you're putting on a new timing belt, what you need to do is remove this bottom cover. So there's just a couple of 10 or 12 millimeter bolts along here that you'd have to remove, as well as the crankshaft pulley down here. So that one's kind of a chore because you have to take off the starter and then put in something into the flywheel to keep the crankshaft from rotating while you're, or rotating I should say, as you're trying to break that bolt free. And so you remove the alternator belt, remove the crankshaft pulley, and then with that bottom cover off, you can slide the timing belt off, but then it's trapped by this engine mount over here. So what you need to do is jack up the engine. So you want to put a block of wood, just kind of like a 2x4 or something on your jack to support the oil pan so you don't puncture the oil pan. Jack up the engine to relieve the stress here, unbolt those, and then take out this engine mount. Once you do that, then you can take the timing belt off, put a new one in, and then bolt the engine mount back on, put the crankshaft pulley back on, tighten that to spec, get your alternator belt back on, and then go through the process of setting the tension for the timing belt, tighten the tensioner, and you're good to go. What we're going to do is I've got my wrench attached to the crankshaft pulley now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to help support the timing belt onto the cam gear so we don't slip any teeth while we're setting the tension in the belt. And so we're going to rotate the crankshaft and get everything moving together. So we want to make sure this doesn't come off at all. We're going to get everything moving together, and again, just kind of support this here, bring everything around a couple of teeth, make sure that we're moving in harmony. And once everything's moving together and it looks like it's good, we're going to tighten the tensioner to spec. And then once we do that, we'll rotate it a little bit more and just make sure that we're still good to go. So rotating it like this just allows the tensioner to do its job. Set the tension in here. And I've seen actually people use binder clips before to hold the timing belt on, but this seems to be working pretty well for me. All right, so we've gone and we've rotated a little bit. So now we want to tighten the tensioner. And once we tighten the tensioner, we should be set and good to go. For the timing belt tensioner, we set our torque wrench to 31. We don't want to set it for any more. We don't want to set it for any less. We want 21 exact, or 31 exactly. And the reason why I say this is the last time I did this job, I over-tightened the timing belt tensioner, and it was a little bit cross-threaded because I pulled the bolt out all the way, and I over-tightened it a little bit. And so in the process, I unknowingly damaged the threads in the block, and because I damaged the threads, the first time I went to start it up, the bolt just kind of kicked out of the block, through the timing belt, bent all the valves. So we want to avoid that. So hopefully you caught that earlier. We don't want to pull out the bolt all of the way. And now we're going to set it to 31 exactly. All right, so we found 31 there, and it took the torque without slipping free or pulling out any threads. So let's just give it a couple of cranks and make sure that we're still moving all together like we should be. Okay, looks good. So we got the timing belt in place. I'm just going to put the spark plug back in there now that we're kind of to a point to start putting everything back together. I'm just going to put the spark plug back in before putting the valve cover back on. Just it's a little bit easier without it in the way. All right, so we'll just hit the spark plug with the torque wrench here real quick. So I just noticed there's a little bit of debris in my oil filler cap. So I'm just gonna get a paper towel and clean that up really quick before putting the valve cover on. At this point, we're ready to get the valve cover back on, but we have all of these old gaskets in here from when we took off the valve cover. So it's kind of up to you if you want to try to reuse the gaskets and not worry about trying to put those in. So once it's finished, get to clean everything up. Looks like there's a little bit of sealant used on here in the past, so hopefully we don't need sealant to get this gasket to go this time around. Okay, got those removed. Let's get the new gaskets in here. So the valve cover gasket is this flimsy thing that hopefully came in your kit, and then these are the spark plug seals here. So we're going to set these off to the side. We're going to go for the valve cover gasket first. And one thing to note, the gasket will have this little tab right here, and that lines up with the valve cover down here. You can see there's that little tab. So you just want to get those lined up. Get into position, but not committing to actually pushing it into place yet. Just want to get it roughly there. And once we're confident that we've got it lined up correctly, then we'll press it in. Okay, that looks to be about it. So now we'll just work along the perimeter, just kind of push it into position. But it looks to sit in there nice. And when working with gaskets, you just want to be careful not to contaminate the surface, the sealing surface, with any debris or anything, because that will keep it from sealing. All right. Yep. Didn't get that one quite pushed in. Double check the valve cover gasket. Just seat that a little bit more. All right, let's take this over and put it on. Normally, before you put the valve cover on, you put the timing belt cover in place and get that in position, and then this sits over the lip on the timing belt cover. So I'll show you here. But I'm just especially paranoid here that I'm not going to get this gasket to seal, so I'm just going to leave it off for now, and then after driving for a little while and checking for leaks, then I'll put the cover back on if it looks like this gasket sealed. Because otherwise the cover here will leak oil into the timing belt cavity, and then the timing belt will be saturated in oil and it'll be a mess. So So getting this into position, we won't be carrying the valve cover on the sides here, so just be sure not to grab that gasket, and then hopefully flip it over. Gasket stay in place, very good. Now just slowly lower it into position and try not to rub the gasket along anywhere. Okay, so we got that in position. Let's go back into our kit and find the caps for those. You can tell there's the two different sizes here of these little caps. So set that there. And this guy. So you can tell these are the larger ones, so that's going to fit the larger cap. Just kind of press that down. Okay, so just slide these down like so. Nuts can go on top. So we'll just hand tighten these, and then I'm going to go look at the manual and see what the torque value is. The torque wrench again. So these valve cover or camshaft cover, whatever, bolts, nuts, wow, really striking out here. So they only get torqued to 7 inch-pounds. So really not much at all. So we just want to go in a alternating pattern around the perimeter of the valve cover here to try to get the gasket to seat. So it might be after we go through once, we'll just go and double check that they're still tight after seating the gasket. And actually what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take this in steps. So I took a couple of turns here. Just want to gently ease the cover down and hopefully seal the gasket. You can see how I'm going around and torquing these. The torque wrench went off, but as I go around, you can see that as I set the other ones at torque, they went a little bit further. So now they're all to 7 reliably, and hopefully that's all it will take to get this thing to seal. So now that I've got this all buttoned up and the engine block is covered and the cylinder head's covered, I'm now going to start trying to put everything back together. So the one thing is I need to fish this wiring harness out from behind the intake manifold and bring that forward. And so I'm just going to kind of work that out, and hopefully it'll come without too much resistance. We'll see here. All right, I got my injectors back, or the connections for them anyways. Okay, so let's start with that, and we'll just get the injectors into position. Now, hopefully you did a better job than I did of keeping track of these little springs here. They're all plugged in. Got the rail back into position. Now I'll just tighten these down. All right, next up, I'm going to go plug everything into the intake manifold underneath. So that's like our PCV valves, all those vacuum tubes that went underneath that were caught up when we were trying to pull out the cylinder head. Those kinds of things, I'm going to take care of those first and then just kind of work my way upward. All right, so I've left you for a while. Word of advice to those at home, put the gasket on before dropping the manifold into place. This is going to be a chore now, wrestling with this. But I just wanted to come back and mention the exhaust manifold. So I've already gone underneath and connected the down pipe to the exhaust manifold, or I guess that's technically the header, whatever. So I've got that connected down here, but now I just need to get the new gasket onto the cylinder head. And then once I have the new gasket on here, I can just get the exhaust manifold in place and then get the 9 bolts in here, get that all nice and tightened down, and then that should complete that step. I could have removed the radiator too, so it's just these 4 bolts here, 2 here, and then just an identical bracket over here. Since we've already drained the coolant, there'd be no harm in removing the radiator. Just those 4 bolts, probably pull out the radiator fan first with these 2 bolts here, and then it just lifts out, has a electrical connector down there. That would have made getting the manifold in here a lot easier, but I managed, so just getting a little creative putting these on here. Requires some dexterity on these lower ones to get in there. Okay, with the exhaust manifold, we're going to tighten these bolts to 22 foot-pounds of torque. And the manual just says to do a spiral pattern. So I'm going to start here, kind of work my way out as I'm going along, and just kind of try to distribute the torque as evenly as I can. So I'm just going to snug these up a little bit before I bring the torque wrench out. Okay, that one's not even hand tight yet. Let's just get the hand tight before we bring the wrenches into this. Likely, if you have a stock exhaust manifold, you're not going to have this issue. In my case, I have this aftermarket exhaust manifold, which was put on here a long time ago by somebody else. And once you know it, this pipe from cylinder 1 comes right in the way of tightening this bolt. So I'm just going to have to use a box end wrench on that and kind of estimate 22 foot-pounds. Okay, to spiral outward, I'm going to come over to here now. Alright, so now we're going to get the torque wrench. Alright, so when installing the distributor, we have a 50-50 chance of getting this right. So if there's a little slot on the inside, on the end of the camshaft, that these 2 tabs go into. And if we get it mixed up, that means we're going to be 180 degrees out of sync. But the good news is, on most of these distributors, it's designed such that it shouldn't fit in the wrong way. So you'll have to give it a try and see what you end up with. There, we got it. So of course my mark has completely disappeared from the cylinder head, but just kind of put it in the center and hope for the best. But be careful with your distributor when you set it aside. I wasn't careful. It fell. Now the rotor cap's broken, so I have to go dig through my pile and find the other distributor and bring over that cap and then hope that the coil is okay still. Okay, so I've been to the auto parts store and I now have a new distributor cap. Be screwed through the metal collar there. Convenient that they screw into the cap like that, because otherwise you'd be left trying to juggle the screw and get it lined up. So just going to put this on here real quick. So if you're in a similar position, just make sure to line up the post first, line that up, and then just get the rest of it on there. So referring to the sacred texts, the firing order is 1-3-4-2. So that's 1-3-4-2. And so the number one position on the distributor is right here, and you can imagine the engine is going, let me think about this for a little bit, this way. And we got the little diagram right here that it's going clockwise. So it means that we're going to go for 1, 3, 4, 2. 1, 3, 4, 2 in that order. Number 1 is on the driver's side, number 4 is on the passenger side. 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. So let's get those spark plugs lined up. 1, 3, 4, 2. That's more for me than it is for you, because I'm going to forget that once I get these spark plugs in here. Okay, so the longest one is number 1, like so. And we're just going to chase that down, plug that into here. And then we've got number 3, we're going to get into here. That goes into here. Right, 3. Then number 4 is the short one. And that is going to go here. And then number 2 goes right into here. Like so. Hopefully we've got those seated. Get the order mixed up on these. It'll look like the engine has spark, but because it's out of time, it won't be firing correctly. And so it won't start, or it'll run really rough because it's only going to be running on a couple of cylinders. So just want to make sure we get that order correct when putting those into place. Now, I think we're ready. We're going to just kind of go through and double check the engine bay, make sure we've got everything plugged in, make sure there's no loose wires. Just kind of run through, double check everything before we get the battery in the intake in here. Because once the battery and intake are in, it's pretty difficult to get into anything. Okay, so now get the battery back into place. Get the little tray back into here, like so. I'm just going to kind of tuck these wires up and out of the way so I can get the battery in here. Okay. So might have to shuffle the battery around to get to this slot in the front. Before I go and connect the negative terminal, I'm just going to get my air intake back in here, just in case I accidentally bump the positive terminal. I don't want it to short out. So we'll get the air box in here, and then we'll connect the negative terminal. Now we're ready for the negative terminal. All right, we are ready for some fluids. Going to be reusing my oil because it's fresh. And so to reuse my oil, I got this enormous funnel, which hopefully is going to help me get the drain pan and get that to pour into here without making a mess. So what's nice about it is it came with this little filter that's meant to fit down into here. just to catch any stuff that might have fallen into the drain pan. So while that's doing its thing, it's usually a good idea just to get underneath of the car and just take a look to see if there's any leaks. So in case you didn't get the oil pan drain plug back into position, just kind of double check for leaks really quick. So I'm just going to let that finish draining off into the engine, and then I'm going to give the engine a couple of minutes for the oil to just kind of fall to the bottom of the pan, because like I said, it's actually pretty cold today. So it's just going to take a while for that to seep into the oil pan and then give me a good reading on the dipstick. So before getting too carried away, just double check that drain cock over on the bottom of the radiator and make sure that's closed tight. And then once that's kind of double checked and we're sure that that's tight, we'll then start pouring some coolant into here. To add coolant to the system, what we're going to do is normally right here on the front of the cylinder head, there's this inlet for the upper radiator hose. And so there's going to be a little tiny screw on here. And what you want to do is you want to remove that screw. Once that screw is removed, you then add coolant to the system, into the radiator, and you keep adding coolant until coolant begins to come out of the screw hole. And once you begin to get coolant out of the screw hole and there's no bubbles in the coolant, then we know it's topped off. So we're going to replace the screw to seal off the system. But then what we do is once we have coolant coming out of there, we know the system's full, then we're going to leave the radiator cap off, start the engine, let the engine run for a while until it gets hot with this cap off and the heater to the hot position. That's going to open up our heater core. We're going to run the engine in that state for a while, and we're going to watch for bubbles to come out here, watch the level, and add coolant as necessary until the engine comes to temperature. And as long as the radiator fan switch is working, when it comes to temperature, the fan should kick on a couple of times, so that's going to be our sign that we're at temperature. And you can also tell by filling this hose, once the engine's at temperature and the thermostat's opened up, this hose will begin to get hot. So once that's to temperature, we'll just keep adding coolant as necessary. And then once we're kind of topped off, we're going to shut off the car, install the radiator cap, and all the while we're just going to be checking for leaks all throughout the system and seeing if there's any coolant coming out anywhere. Okay, just do a quick check for leaks. So because it's more or less a sealed cavity, there's a lot of bubbling as air escapes the system from pouring in. Just kind of watch for that and don't splash coolant in your face. That would suck. Thing I noticed, so I heard dripping. I thought I had a leak somewhere. But it actually was just, as I was pouring in coolant, I had a little bit bubbling up around the funnel here. So just kind of limit your pouring so you don't kind of leak out around the funnel there. Okay, so topped it off here. And there's just a little bit of fluid at the bottom of the funnel. So I'm just going to leave that in there and get this running. And then hopefully it'll suck that in as it displaces air in the engine block once it starts running. Now I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes and just go through the engine bay and just remove any tools or parts or whatever else I've got in here. And then once we're clear of all of that stuff, we should be good to go and see if it'll fire up. We are ready to give this a shot, so here's hoping. So when you first go to start the engine, it's going to take a while because we disconnected the fuel filter. So all of that fuel and the fuel rail and then the fuel filter kind of leaked out. So it'll just take a little while for the pump to prime the system and get fuel in there so it can flow into the engine. So I'm just going to let it sit for a little bit with the fuel pump running, let everything kind of get going in here. Success! That's a good sign. Okay, so we're just gonna let it run for a while, let it get to temperature. I've got a little bit of runoff there on the intake, or on the exhaust manifold, so that just needs to burn off for a little bit here. But one thing, I do have the garage open back there just to ventilate outward, so we don't have a buildup of exhaust gases. But I'm just gonna let it warm up, check for leaks, and see where we're looking. But I mean, it started, so that's a good sign. This is why it's a good idea to check with the engine running that you have any leaks. So I do in fact have a leak, and you can see the firewall here is a little damp. Let's get some light in here so you can kind of see. Turns out I am leaking from this hose, I believe. One of these hoses is leaking. And so this is a bad one. This is a fuel leak. So I need to get these hoses fixed. Okay, so I'm just gonna go take the car for a drive and just see how it does. Just check for any leaks when I get back and make sure it's operating normally, but looks like we got it to work. So if you've watched the video this long, hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you found it useful, maybe consider subscribing or like the video. But either way, hopefully you found it helpful, and as always, thanks for watching, and catch you next time.